I'm going to introduce Ed Skoot, who's the moderator of our next panel, which, as you know, is on the role of funders in collective impact. And I know many of you have already started having discussions on that topic, so here's a chance to continue them. Ed Skoot is a longtime practitioner of and thinker about collective impact before it was called that. His expertise in fundraising to strengthen civil society is practically unparalleled. Prior to becoming director of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society and a professor of practice of public policy at the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University, he was president for 18 years of the Sudan Foundation. CERDNA, pardon me, a 900 million plus family foundation. Ed also founded New Ventures, a nonprofit consulting firm that assisted NGOs in earning income as a complementary to fundraising, which we now call social entrepreneurship. Among his recent publications are the books The Nonprofit Entrepreneur and Scaling Social Impact, New Thinking. Please welcome Ed Skoot.
Just a few more seats to be filled, folks. Particularly up in the orchestra. So feel free. We'll wait 30 seconds as people move in. Welcome. It's my great pleasure to be a moderator of a very distinguished panel, folks who know a lot and who have a lot to say. As we noted before, I was head of the CERDNA Foundation, which is the name Andros spelled backwards, not the Sudan Foundation as here. I simply can't imagine a foundation working in the Sudan right now and having anything more than hard luck. And collective impact would be fairly difficult to make happen. So anyway, it's all our pleasures, I'm sure, to be here and to hear from you as well as give you some thoughts about the day. Our three panelists who will be speaking are the Honorable Norm Rice, who runs the Seattle Community Foundation, former mayor of Seattle, just super smart and good guy. Emmett Carson, also a good guy. We're waiting for well, no, Sterling will. Now, Emmett, now at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and formerly of the Minneapolis Community Foundation. And you're here 6 years now? Or 5 years, right? And then Sterling Speirn, currently CEO of the Kellogg Foundation, and formerly here, and a lot of changing of chairs, but we've still got the right folks in the right places.
Midwest.
Oh, that's a win-win, I think, for everybody. And really delighted to have you here. In a sense, this is kind of a wrap-up session, and your points of view are as important as ours. But we're going to begin by my just going down, Norm, Emmett, Sterling, for 2 to 3 minutes each. And the question I wanted to put to them on your behalf is, so what'd you hear today that was really important? I mean, what was the thing that you would, or two things, that you would take home with you and tell your 16-year-old son or daughter, I heard something today that was really important and I'm going to tell you about it. So this is an opportunity to make that statement. Norm, why don't you begin?
I was thinking about that, and I think the two things that I would think so much about collective impact is that getting us to a common frame and a common vocabulary about what's necessary to bring about change is really crucial. It allows us to talk to one another and share data around some consistent kinds of points of view that can help to inform and move philanthropy and partners in the right direction. But I would say, quickly say that as good as that is, there's a lot more work to be done. The work that needs to be done is to connect the collective impact structure to the community. because if you can't see your faces in the data and the places, it can go for naught. If you can't see a pathway to opportunity on the roadmap where you fit and where you move along, it can stall. So it's really saying I got work to do with working with those who work with Collective Impact in Seattle to make sure that that pathway and that roadmap is full of opportunities rather than roadblocks.
And you mean transparent too. Good. Emmett?
Yeah, Ed, that's a tough question. You stumped me right at the beginning because when my daughter was 16, she never cared what my day was like. So I stumbled on the idea that she wanted to know what I learned on anything. So she's 20 and that hasn't changed.
Emmett's your second chance.
I know. I'd start off with, I was at a conference and I learned that we're better together. That when the best of us come together, we're even better. We don't know how to measure who's the best of us, so we don't know who to get together. But if we could figure it out, boy, wouldn't the world be better. And I say that tongue in cheek, but I mean that realistically, because I thought Deanna was just fabulous and marvelous. But to extend on her example, I don't know who to invite over to help me cook the meal. And so unless I know something prior about the people I'm going to learn from, people will never ever come to my house again for dinner. And I will have learned a lot and they will have hated the meal. But it wasn't a win-win. It's only a win-win when I get the best cooks with the best recipes, with the best things. And then it's a win-win. And determining or figuring out how I know who to help me in that process to get to a win-win is, right, that little detail that makes all the difference in the world as to whether everybody's saying, boy, it was wonderful, when are you going to do it again? Or everybody stopping at McDonald's or the hospital on the way home. And so that's what I'd tell my 16-year-old if she ever cared, or my 20-year-old now that she still doesn't care.
Sterling.
Well, I heard Eric at the very beginning of the day, and I didn't know Ed was going to ask us these questions, saying that collective impact, an idea whose time has come, and I put again. You know, Mark Twain, I think, said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And when you've been in a field long enough, you say, oh yeah, that's what Sid Gardner was talking about 15, 20 years ago, railing against categorical funding. I think it was before the label of silo had actually been used in the nonprofit or government sector. There were categorical funding. But the idea of trying to get people to work across their categories and across their sectors has been an issue I think our field has struggled with for a long time. And so I'm delighted that collective impact brings this issue back to us in some way that says, hey, maybe we ought to take a look at this again. Right here on the peninsula, we started talking about community support organizations. So I love Backbone or No Bone, you know, because it's true. And the article's pretty clear about funders saying, you funders have to fund something different. And I don't know how many funders are willing to do that. I heard Jeff say all solutions had to come from within and you can't bring anything in from the outside. He didn't say it quite like that. I said, oh, so it's adaptive leadership, but not adoptive leadership. And I think we struggle with looking for best practices, and yet not invented here always means like, well, we have to go slower because we got to bring locals along to get to best practices, when for some of us who can roam the country looking for, oh, that is the best way to do after school, without cramming it down my local community's throat, say, would you like to go look at the birthing center in Washington, D.C. and see how they're having a huge impact on healthy birth outcomes for poor women of color? And if someone says, yeah, I want to say, good, now we can grow it here. So finally I heard Jeff say on one of his slides, what we're doing, we have to create a civic infrastructure. And I put equals democracy. A lot of us talk about community engagement, civic engagement, And I think some of the power of collective impact, it gives people across sectors, and probably from small to big, saying, where else can I go to influence in a collective way the visions and shared aspirations of the people in this community? That's what a democracy gives its people. You decide how to govern yourselves and organize yourselves, and there aren't many places people can go to do that, certainly not in the formal political process, but a civic infrastructure about the future of a community, I think was a pretty powerful notion to say this isn't just a mechanical undertaking, this is not allowing people to participate in a different way.
I think that's one of the things I really feel strongly about is the civic engagement process that is complementary to collective impact has to occur. And one of my favorite lines I use a lot is that Chinese, go to the people, learn from them, love them, start with what they know and build on what they have. But of the best leaders, when their task is accomplished, their work is done, the people will remark that they've done it themselves. The collective impact has to translate back to the people who feel that you have heard them, and you translate the data and the information in a way that resonates with them rather than just the collective. Then you have the true partnership and the compact that allows you to really leverage change.
Well, one of the things that falls out of the three things, the three remarks you've made, tends to be looking at it, our task from the bottom up as well as from the top down. And I think the general agreement would be you got to do them both, you got to do them right, and consistently work at it. And yet I would look around and say, we who have been funders, who are funders now, are in a pretty strange position. Much as Strive gives us a very clear indication of the kinds of pathways we might take. All morning and afternoon we heard the word humility. Not the most common in the foundation lexicon. We heard essentially that this is a long-term build. I mean, just going down, working with folks, trying to get the data, trying to even organize and orchestrate the data will take a long time. Well, the pressure from funders increasingly, I would argue, is you know, not unlike private sector stuff. Well, let's see the stuff come out. Where is it? What's your one-year goal and so forth? So we seem to have, I think we could make the case that the kinds of requirements that would bring CI, collective impact, to the current scene in a vigorous way are not natural to the philanthropic community. And it may be that Cincinnati has been quite lucky with Kathy Merchant, and there are a few others that have, but how do you address your colleagues? What do you say to them that if you want collective impact and you believe it, you've got to change your ways? I mean, is that a fair statement to make? And then how do you go about doing it?
No, I'll start. So I begin by thinking collective impact is a very useful tool, but in certain situations. I don't think all of the grant making becomes collective impact. I don't think every organization drops all of the projects that it has. I think you pick and choose where does collective impact, that strategy, that methodology make the most sense. How do you do that? Where do you start there? And in doing that, you make a commitment that it's long-term. In doing so, you understand part of what comes with this approach is a long-term approach. And so I don't think it's necessarily the funders having a sea change, right? Just like I don't think suddenly all nonprofits who work in a space have a sea change. I think you start with a group of willing partners who can share a set of value judgments to start on a path. And if they can get there, if they can say, we're on that path, then they open it up along the way to others to join in that path. But I think too often we take these concepts and it becomes an all or nothing. And I think that's the challenge here. I think it is useful for a tool, and I suspect that it is more useful in situations of enormous urgency, right? So you're on the boat, you're with 5 people, and it's sinking. We've got to plug this leak. What do you have? I've got this, I've got that, and everybody's all in from the beginning, to use an ALF term. We're all in, right? But when you don't have that urgency, people are degrees of less in, right? And so you've got to find the issue in which the corporations, the nonprofits, the foundations, the government officials feel it's so bad, it's so urgent. In Japan right now, everybody's all in, right? Because it's a crisis. When there's an earthquake, people are all in. How do we begin to get people to understand where education is today, where immigration policy is today, and get a group of people then who are all in? And as you get all in around an urgent matter, then you have the stamina to go long term. So I think it's a quiver among many quivers as to how we can approach things, and to put it in its right context, and not to try to superimpose it in a context that may not be the right fit.
Right. So would you argue that post-Katrina activity was not an all-in situation?
I think it was an all-in situation, and groups like the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation and others are still there, trugging away, doing work. For others of us, it was a transitory event. We were all in for a moment, and then we had donor fatigue. But for the communities that are there that are rebuilding, they're still doing that rebuilding work. They're disappointed in the rest of us, but they haven't stopped. So in that regard, they're in. And they knew it was long term. They talk in terms of this is a 10, 15, 20-year rebuilding effort. They're really clear about what it's going to take. It was the rest of us that thought you could lose 80%, right? You're a pianist with 10 fingers, you lose 80%, and then we say, why can't you play with 2?
And then I think it got stalled in Louisiana because, remember when it first started out, the leadership went to Texas to talk about how they were going to build New Orleans instead of talking to the people and building on what they had. Mm-hmm. And that disconnect took a long time. They had to go do it over again in order to get it right, because they were thinking about 2 different constituencies and not thinking about the whole of the city.
Right. Sterling, you were going to say something.
Well, I mean, we are in New Orleans, and we have been since the storm, and we're one of the smaller group that are staying for the next generation. So I read the article and I say, well, we have a pretty exciting ecology of funders and Mitch Landrieu, the mayor. I wonder if this framework of collective impact might give us a chance to take our game to the next level. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, I would agree with Emmett in terms of urgency and the sinking boat, but the other argument is it takes a for any large social problem, if you don't have a long-term approach and know how to measure your progress on the way, this term donor fatigue baffles me. You know, I mean, that's the work we're in. You know, and it's true. Like it's a mantra in the field. You got to have some early short-term wins. Look for the low-hanging fruit. It's like, no, we're looking for the high-hanging fruit. You know, I mean, but we always play this game about, well, we get fatigue or we change. And we were saying earlier, maybe Cincinnati's hopeful. We don't have one big city urban school district that is successful in this country. And Michael Bennett, when he was superintendent in Denver, said that before he said, wouldn't it be good if we could at least show the American people, at least in one place in this country, kids are successfully graduating high school and going, it's like just one. So who's going to get to be the first donor collective or group of people that is Norm going to do it in Seattle? Is Emmett going to do it here in Silicon Valley? But some group of people have to sit around and say, if we commit ourselves for a generation, we would have a chance to do that. The other thing I think is swirling around in terms of donor behavior is the work that Catherine Fulton and the Monitor Institute did a decade ago on looking out for the future and cultivating change in philanthropy talked about exploiting cooperative advantage. You know, and collective impact talks, I think it essentially says, that's what you do. You know, you're not competing. You're all trying to accomplish something. How do you exploit cooperative advantage? And their latest report said act bigger. And I think collective impact gives donors a chance to act bigger than any individual is. But there's also, I think, an issue of the metaphors of our work, and it came up earlier today. Is it a marketplace of activity? And the frustration people have that write about our field, Lucy Bernholtz and others, why philanthropy is so irrational. individual donors, they do whimsical things. They want to do their own thing. They want to invent things. They don't want to copy other people. It's not a rationally behaving, and nor are big foundations or little foundations. But so in a marketplace, everybody can do their own. That you can buy, you can sell. It's a free for all. But remember, Adam Smith wrote in Wealth of Nations, the invisible hand works. That somehow people pursue their own immediate needs. Corporations sell certain products, and on the whole, markets provide social good. In our field, collective impact is essentially saying there is no invisible hand in the philanthropic marketplace. We continue to pursue our individual initiatives, and we become enamored with them. But then in 5 or 10 years, we say, but darn, the world didn't change much. That no invisible hand was suddenly making all foundation work and all nonprofit work and all government work bubble up to like tide is rising. I mean, if anything, the trends in our country in education, health, or financial systems are downward. So it's certainly like, it would be good if we, the other thing I think, which I know there wasn't time to talk about, is there were some profound, every element in the collective impact, the idea, Jeff said this morning, of evidence-based decision-making. That is a profound, if our communities and the entities in all 3 sectors did evidence-based decision-making, that would be a huge accomplishment. Governments don't do that. Certainly, donors, they do what they want to do. They're not accountable to evidence. And then I have to ask about, having a common agenda. For those of us, who care about the racial history of our country, everybody immediately says, who got invited? Emmett was sort of saying, who got invited to the table? I mean, is it the old guard trying to let go and let the new guard? But that common agenda, I have to, like, how do communities figure out, there's a group of people that have been marginalized for a couple of decades or centuries, and suddenly there's going to be a common agenda. Well, that sort of raises the issue, I guess we're going to have to do some work on our racial equity, as well as this sort of rational work on improving systems and services. So I'm very curious how collective impact communities are going to work on that threshold issue when they're trying to decide who to invite to the dinner party.
Just give 1 second. Let's take Norm and then you go. Norm?
One of the things that we're trying to do at the Seattle Foundation is, number one, look at our total philanthropy and ask ourselves along the elements that we think are crucial to building communities where we can intersect with the collective impact. So can we give communities small victories that show that you're seeing their immediate need before you come up with the grand design so that they'll travel this journey with you? That's one. Number two, we are looking at how we allocate all the resources and where are the priorities. So education is already a high priority. Now, can we use that strategically to move this along? And third is a concept that we're just exploring with the board. We're going to have to show some place-based investments that prove that this can work. So can we find places within the county of King, where Seattle sits, that we might be able to then experiment with targeted dollars to start to make this happen? I'm suggesting to my board about 4 areas. And what's the criteria? There has to be a zone and a cradle. So from cradle to career, there needs to be early childhood, there needs to be grade school, there needs to be a middle school, there needs to be high school, there needs to be community colleges or voc tech in those areas. And can we target some of our investments to take along that continuum and start to see where change can be? So that brings in the element of collaboration, that brings in the element of community building, and that starts to get our board, and I think our communications with our donors, that there's an opportunity for them to invest. We're not going to get all our donors, but we do have some discretionary dollars that we can more target to help this collective impact get legs.
Emmett?
Follow up on something Sterling said that I think was very important, and that's about the evidence-based decision making. And one of the parts of collective impact that we need to spend, I think, more time thinking about, being nuanced about, is who decides the measurements that will decide what's important. So, for example, I go to an after-school program of Hispanic kids, right? And they have a different rhythm, a different energy, a different commitment. The role models are different. If I set the metrics against success for that nonprofit, best in class, they're the model, a whole lot of mainstream boys and girls clubs or groups like that are going to fall by the wayside. However, I go to the Boys and Girls Club and I use them as the metric for the most effective, best organization. Some of these other groups are going to fall by the wayside. So this notion of effective measurement and what gets measured and what gets anointed as, boy, you're high performing if you do it this way and get these results, but if you do it that way, well, you know, you're not measuring up on those standards, are essential when you start talking about collective alignment. And so it's not to say don't measure, don't let the message be, I'm saying don't use evidence-based, but what I'm trying to say is what I think Sterling and both Norm were saying, being nuanced about how you understand the implications of that and how you really dialogue about that so you don't have unintended consequences of who's getting cut out because you're myopic in how you do your best work, unaware of how others do their best work, and so the collective doesn't represent. That's what happens now with standardized testing, right? We build a frame around learning, around a particular learning group and a particular learning style, and then we get shocked that others don't fit into that. So again, I think we've got to, it's not saying that's a part not to have. I'm just trying to say we've got to be nuanced in understanding as we get to what is the evidence that we build it up from a collective point of view, or we're going to have the very things that Sterling was talking about where people get cut out as a result of how we framed it, not a result of measures that are more nuanced and carefully constructed.
You know, it strikes me that we're almost replicating on the stage the kinds of conversations or early conversations that will take place in lots of communities or are taking place now about, well, how the hell do we do this? You know, how do we measure it right? How do we get everybody to buy in? How do we get the commitments that are needed? And so on. And so with the knowledge that each of the folks here brings, you know, across the country, well, what it seems to me as a listener of your commentary is that the term collective impact is a terrifically meaningful and galvanizing term, and yet we've got to be really careful to do it as well as we possibly can. The more slipshod we are in this one, we can make the machine fall to pieces pretty quickly.
The underlying issue is trust.
Yep.
And can we trust you to deliver for us this greater sense of urgency about education and opportunity and achievement? And how do you build trust? And that is in itself as complicated as it is getting the data. And it's a twofold kind of strategy. So it isn't like you do get the data, and the data now will get the community aroused and they'll champion for that. People don't make decisions around education that way. They make decisions around their school, in their neighborhood, where their child goes. And so you've got to understand how to take that communications aspect and begin to talk to them in their language, in their way. And that's resources, that's dollars. Those are things that at the end of the day, you want that community to say, I heard you, I want to participate, and I know that you care. And that takes some time, but you can do it. But it's the collective and the engagement that has to kind of come together in a strategic way.
What came through, thank you for that, Norm, and I'm going to tease something out of it. What came through from what you said in the paper by John and Mark was, and many of the comments today, was the idea of organizing around the problem as opposed to organizing around the organization, and trying to actually make a mind shift so that we in the world of philanthropy, who more often than not tend to back an institution or a couple of institutions, need to step back a bit and look at the problematic components and then see where the integration of the work can go. Is that a fair formulation to take that, whether it's immigration or K-12 or whatever it would be, and not deviate from keeping our eyes on the problem and therefore the solution? Any thoughts about that or no?
Well, I think one issue is how we practice collective impact inside our institutions. You know, how do you take your immigration work and connect it to your education work, to your health work? I mean, the Kellogg Foundation works in 3 key areas: in education and learning, in food, health, and well-being, and family economic security. Those could be 3 divisions all doing great work. But our challenge to ourselves has been, no, we want to do all those things in a few places where we work. Now, how do we get our program staff to know the language? So my whole staff knows all about our food work. Whether you do early childhood or you do family economic security, you know our food work. We have a playbook and everybody knows that. Now we have to go out and find communities, because our communities are also like, well, the food people come at us and want to do food work, and we say, well, we don't want to just do food work. We want to do breastfeeding and school food and urban agriculture, and how does that link to family economic security and early childhood? So if we're trying to get it together inside, then when we go out, we want to work in communities that those people see the same connections. And so we need people to come to us and say, we want to work on all those things too. Well, no one nonprofit or government agency is going to want to work on all those things, but they also understand the connections of their work. So that's a challenge, I think, is are we actually walking the talk inside? Or, I'm not saying, as I think Emmett and Norm said, you could just say, well, we just do that in education. Strive is a good example. Just in education, we're going to do cradle to career. But I think that you miss something, you know, if you take something like, well, these child savings accounts, the asset folks talk about that, but the early childhood people don't talk about it, and the food people could be talking about that. So I think it is a challenge, because the more you're trying to connect inside, then you look for people outside that will reinforce those connections.
Mm-hmm.
What shaped me in my philosophical view of education was I ran for mayor under a very divisive issue to repeal busing in the city of Seattle. It was very divisive. It was ugly. It was, and I decided an hour before the deadline that I had to jump in the race. Stupid me, but nonetheless, because I felt that number one, it would divide the city, and number two, they were repealing the wrong thing, and that we had to bring the debate around to quality education and not busing. And how do you do that? Well, we learned that we called an education summit. We spent almost better part of a year bringing the community together to talk about what are the elements of a quality education effort. And from that effort, we created a city initiative. It wasn't a philanthropic effort to make every child safe, healthy, and ready to learn. That was the city's responsibility, and they passed a family and education levy, and they passed it twice, and we're hopeful that they will pass it again to make the kinds of investments that we need to have to help with the collective impact. But it was the trust of the community were those people who felt that they built that levy themselves, and they could see the connection. All I want to keep pushing on is make sure the community sees the connection and not just a construct that somehow doesn't relate to them on a daily basis. Because if they can't relate to it, they ought to be able to tell their neighbor what collective impact means and what's the value going to be for them so that they join that fight. That's the message, and that has to be strong, and it has to be invested in as much as we do in the education kinds of changes that we want to have.
Well, to push on you a little bit, and maybe the audience has some thoughts about it as well, I can see myself being a member of the local community as a PTA member or just someone, in household or someplace, and say, not again. I mean, another one. We've got another spin of the wheel, and collective impact came up this time. So here's Norm Rice talking to me about, collective impact. Well, I've been through big society, great society, greater society, little society, no society, et cetera, et cetera. I want to, lead back, and then we'll go to the audience. That kind of near or real cynicism, with the early conversation about needing humility to make something work, and where the divide is. I as a community member, am really troubled, or might be really troubled, if the message and the medium were not really good, that I would just be taken advantage once again. Do each of your histories say something different, or can they say something different?
I actually believe that battles are constant, so you have to do them over again. So it isn't going to be, you're going to have to go back and do this again. But let's just look at the landscape. In a year, our communities are going to be hit so hard with all these cuts that are coming down the pike for education, for health, for shelter, for food, and the like. The investment in education and the reality of what education is as an opportunity to help us in this process is crucial. It's almost a national emergency that we look at what we're doing with our kids and get them prepared so that they can be competitive for a job that may come rather than sitting on the sidelines. So if I had $1 that I had to give, it would go to education in some form along that roadmap, because it's probably, you can't get a bang out of it. And that's what you've got to communicate, people, is that what's going to free you so that you can be competitive in this world, it's going to be still that educational investment that's going to make a difference. And it's along that continuum. And our job is to try to explain it. And I think we can, but it's not an easy job. But then I wouldn't have it this job if I didn't think it was easy.
Okay. Either of you gentlemen, Sterling? No?
You know, I share some of what you said, Ed, and at the same time, I think I go to where Sterling started, which is it's useful because it's put an important tool back in front of us with new twists to it. It's not for every situation. So for me, I'm very context-oriented, right? It's looking at the context where I have some willing partners who actually share with the values, who come together. That's a great, right, as I read the article, that's a great setup for this collective impact model. Where I don't have that, where I don't have enough crisis, where I don't have enough shared value, where there isn't the urgency, I don't want to overlay this because it doesn't say to me that there are other tools that I have to work through the system. One thing I do want to make clear, it made me think when Norm said trust. Understand how I read the model. They didn't say this. At some point, I'm going to learn who gets better outcomes doing similar kinds of work. Once I figure out all the measurement stuff that I talked about, somebody's going to do better than somebody else. I want to support those that are doing a better job. The community wants me to support those that are doing. If it's the center in DC that's getting better outcomes, I want to figure out to use that model here, adapt it, adopt it, and get better outcomes. So understand at the end of collective impact, for me, is trying to direct dollars that have a better impact along a continuum. And I'm comfortable with that. To me, that's the trust at the front end of saying, at some point, I'm going to get good data back that's going to say these outcomes are different. And that ought to now inform how we all think about it. I hope enlightened nonprofits would say, we want to adapt and adopt the better practice because we want to do better. But whether they do that on their own or not, my funding imperative is going to be to support those that are doing better. And that's where the sticky part really hits the road, right? And I just want to be honest in the trust. We talk about a spirit of candor in our organization. And in that spirit of candor, to understand that that's a natural outcome from my perspective, which is a good outcome. But it is a challenging outcome because now everybody's shoulders went way up high. Right? Oh, is that what it means? I didn't know, right? Whoa, this collective impact thing. But that's a natural outgrowth to me of if I'm learning over time what gets better. and we've gotten the measurements right at the front end, then I ought to use that to inform where we can get the community better. And either you adapt and adopt to those practices, or, you know, from my vantage point, I'm going to ask my staff, why are we supporting that? If we've learned that that's not the best way to get results in the Latino community, or this community, or that community, I want to get the best results for people. That's my mission set. And that's the woo, right? But that's what we need to accept going into that model for me. And it wasn't said by the authors, but that's what I pull from it as a old dog funder.
Well, let's go to the ooh.
That's right.
This is your conference. Yes.
I just
Sterling,
also wanted to
please.
acknowledge, apologize for our gender imbalance up here, but we're all community foundation, either former or current, and the part of the article that focused on place-based work versus the oceans or cocoa as industries, but the application of this, of collective impact to real places is what attracts me and our foundation in trying to say what's the next generation of place-based work. And I appreciate Emmett's bringing new optics to metrics. I do think that the nuances of what works for what kinds of kids and what circumstances are key, but my sense is from Strive stories is all those discussions are not idiosyncratic to the individual foundation funding that. They're on top of the table and people argue and discuss, how are you measuring that? And the idea that there are actually common understandings or at least ongoing debates. Well, we think we're measuring it this way, but those are usually private conversations that someone has, and it's never held up to the light of a larger audience or jury that would say, you know, make your case here and show me your evidence and make sure it's not one size fits all. But, you know, we've been through a decade or more of great workshops on what works. As if, and it's either looking for the silver bullet or that our problem is an engineering problem. You know, it's just what works. And for those of us who read Lee Shore's book, Common Purpose, years ago, when Lee documented all the best practices in so many programs, and yet they were sitting on a shelf, or that nonprofit had gone out of business. Again, an irrational sector. People demonstrate, they get startup funding, they prove a model, proof of concept, but it doesn't go to scale. So I've sort of felt the issue isn't the question what works. And actually Peter Block's wonderful book, The Answer to How is Yes, which is, it's not what works. There's plenty of great ways to find out what works. To me, it's more the question of who cares. And you say, well, everybody cares. I mean, people, you could go out and knock on doors and everybody would say, I want our schools to be effective. So it's not who cares, but well, how do I get to care? It seems to me collective impact sets a table. It says, you come to this table and you're committing yourself to a common agenda to achieve something remarkable. And I like the idea of the way it was in the slides, which is you don't hold people accountable in some sort of retributive kind of way. You make yourself accountable because you come to a place and say, I'll work on this if you'll work on this, and we will hold each other accountable because it's a covenant, not because Norm got elected mayor and now if he doesn't deliver, he's out. It's like, you know, we get people not to be armchair. They want to get involved and say, what can I do to advance this common agenda? And if people have no place to go and do that, then they sit back and just say, I don't know, our government isn't working very well, and the market doesn't solve all our problems, but when there's a table set by somebody who's willing to fund that backbone and stay there, it's like, oh, there's a place I can go where people are actually taking what works and trying to put it in a way that actually is advancing and getting better all the time. And as simple as that seems, it is profoundly challenging in our communities. And I think that's, people want, I think what collective impact also says, you can have hope. You can have hope that we can solve some of these so-called intractable problems. But if people don't believe you can, and that's the other issue, like, no, I can show you the literature, there's 100 good ideas on how to do this, but people don't know that and they don't see it in their community. So I just think the idea that people realize their fates are shared and there's a place they go where people talk about that that's a contribution far beyond just the programmatic alignment that comes out of a collective impact. There's common purpose, there's shared fates, and we are going to do this as a community, as a place.
And I think one of the last things I would just say, the foundation, besides the funds that it has that it could allocate to help people, is the right place to convene this discussion, to collaborate, and to continue that conversation dialogue. In some ways, it's even though everybody wants our money, it's a more neutral forum to have this discussion than any other entity that you might have, because the other entities want something. Most people want something from us, so they will come to that meeting. They will begin to talk, and they will begin to share, and they will begin to act in a way because they know that they can influence what we might do if they are willing to participate.
Well, I would capsulize it in part from what Sterling was saying, particularly is we're talking about different ways of thinking, different ways of organizing, and different ways of behaving. And each of them, when joined in the proper amounts, perhaps most likely around a problem and around a place-based component or area, might offer enormous opportunity. But it's this new or different way of thinking, behaving, and organizing that strikes me as being the core sentiment, as well as the basic ideas behind lots of stuff that's been lying around for many years, but not orchestrated in a way that maybe hits it in the right way. So let's go to the floor. Pull no punches. Feel free, this is your conference. Have we got some questions or comments? That lady in the back.
Hey,
Please identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Irene. I'm with Tides, and I had two questions. So one is, in terms of funding decision making, how do you make the decision to fund a collaborative, knowing that that will sometimes take away from the direct services and people who are participating in that collaborative? And the second question would be then, sometimes I would definitely argue that nonprofits are often siloed because funders are often siloed. So if you could speak a little bit to kind of the collective impact at the funder level in the terms of how much communication and coordination is going on amongst funders to then, kind of build that sort of structure and kind of set that tone in the field.
Wow, big question, big questions. Gentlemen?
I'm happy to take it. On the first...
To about a minute and a half, so we can get
Okay, I'll be quick. It's with difficulty, right? I mean, you look at a collaborative and you ask, who's around the table? Do they have the right people, for me, the right people around the table to create the right discussion and the right energy? Is the timing right? Is the opportunity right? And if it is, then that gives it a nod in my sense that it's opportunity-based. On the part about funder collaboratives, I'm always a little hesitant because what gives me comfort as a funder is that if I'm not smart enough to figure out that it was a good idea, if my team wasn't smart enough to figure it out, somebody else in the community that's a funder is smart enough to figure it out. And so if you get all of us with groupthink, good ideas won't get through. So I look to try to, again, be strategic in why are we coming together? What are the things that we're trying to accomplish? But I don't want all of my education work to go through the collaborative, all of my immigration work to go through the collaborative, because I want to have the creativity for the good idea that none of us were smart enough to see. So it's a both and not an either or.
The funder collaborative for me is that in order to get to scale, I'm going to need partners. And I've got to look to find how many people I can bring to the table so that we can enlarge the effort, especially if you're going to have a place-based strategy, that you're going to need more than just the Seattle Foundation. You're going to need other foundations and other people helping you along that way. But I do think that the collaborative impact, that group needs to be invested in, because the data is important. And the data can help form the public debate. And without that data, you're kind of railing, and you need that data to really make your case in all the forums that you have to bring on new partners. And so it's crucial to have it, or else you're going to be at a loss to really make your case.
I thought the article worked hard to differentiate funder collaboratives from collective impact. What collective impact offers is that whatever you do, there's probably a role for you in this community's work. You don't have to change anything you do. Just come to the table and tell us, if you're just strictly do tutoring or mentoring, as one of the examples, how does that fit into the common agenda rather than being out there in left field? And you might, sitting at the table, might say, wow, I've learned a lot about not only my work, but I'm thinking I should do more in immigration. But it's not a collaborative. Everybody can bring whatever they bring to the table. I think that the supposedly hard question, fund direct services versus long-term community problem solving, you know, when any of us ask ourselves the S word, you know, how are you going to sustain your program? It seems to me that the inherent sustainability of our work in communities is that it's the community's work. And if the community, again, Cincinnati's our poster child today, but if that community says, look, this is our project, so it's no one funder's money that we need to sustain this. This is our project, and we will tax ourselves to raise more money once we build this, or we will find out ways. But if I just do direct service and don't fund the underlying community problem-solving process, I think it's always short-term, and it's always gap-filling, and it's never like, yeah, but it just evaporated because there was no there beyond the service provider providing services. So, but it shouldn't be either or. But you're right, at any given time, some funder's going to say, I have long-term investments, I have short-term investments.
Right. Yes, right here.
I'm going to be unfair and ask two questions.
Identify yourself.
Pardon?
You identify yourself.
Amplify? Is that better?
Identify.
Identify, I'm sorry, Peter Pennekamp from Humboldt County.
Thanks, Peter.
So the first one has to do with who's at the table. And we talk about accountability, but accountability is easy for a foundation to do with people that it's funding or bringing to the table. It's sort of a metaphor in reverse, right? And so the question is, how can you play as a real equal at a table, really about the collective in the way that was discussed today, in a way that you actually are accountable? How do you manifest accountability so it's as real for you as it may be for the school district or the community organization? So that's the first question. And the second one has to do with, there's a lot of talk about collective impact and about organizations. And how do you get the best organization that really deliver for their people, you know, all of that. And here would be the observation, which is that if you look at the Harlem Children's Zone, Sterling, you pointed this out earlier actually, there's 15 years of development before anyone really took a look at that. In our neck of the woods, there's a big Indian health center was developed, lots of funders involved. Everyone wants to throw money at them because there's sort of an international model for indigenous people. And you talk to people on the board and they go, you know, where were they 30 years ago when we were developing it? One thing they say. The second thing they say is, this becomes about a building, it's not about health anymore. And there's this very odd tension towards the funding community wanting to institutionalize a community, right, as opposed to understanding the community. So there's the two questions. How do you deal with that? How does that fit into the picture?
Anybody? I'm not sure I know where I am.
That's rather circular, so I don't know if I can answer it in the way, but all I'm looking at is that I believe that we're embarking on new ways of doing business. And the collective impact is a new way of kind of amassing data and bringing it together in a way in which we can strategically plan. I like the tool, I like the mechanism. If I don't like it, I need to be involved in challenging it to be more responsive to the communities that I have. And that's what you do. And you do it either through the dollars that you grant for helping people along that way, or the dollars that you give for funding the collective impact. So you stay attuned to it, you stay involved in it, and you have to be a partner in it. I don't think you can sit back and watch it develop in your community and you don't have anything to do with it. You ought to be engaged. The second thing is then you need to ask yourself, as you look at the collective impact data and the like, are there ways in which our existing philanthropy can help? And if it can, are there organizations that will help them along that way? The foundation has to teach too. I don't think we can wait just for the data to come in. We've got to challenge this process ourselves and to be a partner in it. I do agree with Emmett. It's not a panacea for all the problems of education in a community. It's an opportunity, though, to galvanize a community in a different way. And you ought to see that for that opportunity and not try to build it as the panacea for all education's ills, because it's not going to quite get there.
Okay, let's do one more, and then maybe a quick wrap-up. Looks like that one.
Alan Berkowitz, Environmental Volunteers. We're based here in Palo Alto. We provide science and environmental education resource programs to local schools. We had a theory that we asked ourselves, what if we could get all these great peer organizations with their great programs doing great work? What if we could take my organization's 2-hour program and the 2-hour programs of other organizations and deliver them in a logical fashion to the same classroom so that collectively we could increase science education for schools? At the end of the story, or by this point, we now have 12 organizations doing just that, but in the very, very early days when it was just a theory, not one but 2 foundations who funded the idea, the pilot, said to me, we understand that this is an idea, and we think it's an exciting idea, and we understand it's an unproven idea, and we want to give you the room to fail. I mean, we want you to either make it work and identify why it works and how to scale it, or if it doesn't work, we'd like you to come back and help us understand why it didn't work. So my question, my comment, has to do with the long view that you talked about, Emmett. The long view sometimes is going to have to involve stumbling and failing, and I understand it's not a great business model for a foundation to encourage failure, but it really does free us up to focus on what we think is the right way to go without having to take the short view of, you know, in 12 months I have to report back to these folks some success because I want that grant again next year. So I guess my question is, how do you as foundations, how might you as foundations build into support for collective impact the opportunity to stumble?
Well, I would think all of us believe that we get a lot of failures. We don't call them failures, we call them learning opportunities. We don't plan for them, and the organizations don't plan for them, but we accept that's part of what we do. And in fact, a failure doesn't mean that you're out, right? A failure doesn't mean, oh, well, you failed, it's over with. A failure may mean we learned a whole lot, and now we're ready to retool and go back at it based on what we've learned. What I look for is, A, how open are you about the failure, the shortcomings, and what did you learn that says we ought to take another bet on you? Because every bet on you is a bet that I don't make on somebody else who's saying I'm ready to try to fail too. So it is this environment of a lot of people who are willing to fail. And if you fail 3 or 4 times, I started to say, well, maybe you're a failure. And I want to bet on somebody else, right? And I say that teasingly. I don't know what the number is. But what I'm saying is that I also have come to recognize, it's a painful thing to say out loud, but I'm trying to be more honest about what I really think. That'd be hard for some to believe that I'm being more honest. But in a short fashion, I also bet on people. And there are people who find a way out of no way consistently, right? And so I believe in a plan, but I also believe in people. And I think you see that in a lot of projects. You see that Jeffrey Canada can't just be replicated, even though everybody's trying to do Harlem Children's Zones. He is an incredible leader. And so I need to match finding that incredible leader with that idea. I just can't take that idea, that strategy, what Sterling was saying. It's not a manufacturing process. So I am also looking for great leaders who say, I have the passion, the vision, the board, and I don't know how quite I'm going to get there. This is my starting plan. But if Martin Luther King came to us and said he wanted to start a movement by getting arrested and having little kids bitten by dogs, that was his strategic plan to bring social justice, we wouldn't have funded him. So you got to bet on people. and not just the plan.
Emmett, I think we wouldn't fund it, we just not respond to it.
He didn't have a 501c3.
That's right. How could he get it?
But I would disagree with just the way Emmett said that. You know, Winston Churchill said the hallmark of a successful person is the ability to go from one failure to another with undiminished enthusiasm. So take collective impact. I think the notion is why failure is a riddle in our world. We should take more risks. That is that the value proposition usually is the promise coming in is I promise you this is a successful project. I need your money. Versus I would say in collective impact we are trying to move the ball here. Some things work, some things not. Anybody got a new idea on what might work? And if the proposition is this might work, and I've got some evidence, I mean, David Kelly, who runs the D School here at Stanford, and he's on the cover of the Alumni Magazine, and he started IDEO, they say, you know, you got to fail early and often when you're trying stuff like what you guys tried. You just have to say to the funder, you know, okay, I think this is going to work with Hispanic kids in after school. Can I try it? And then it's like, and like Thomas Edison, I found 10,000 ways how not to make a light bulb until I got there. So it's just like, who's innovating in the space where we don't know how to do it? And so I think...
I don't think we're disagreeing. No. All I'm trying to be clear is if you
fail
every time and all the time, at some point I'm going to say I want to bet on another horse. And so, I mean, that's the reality of the business that I'm in. If a teacher always fails with her kids, and there are other teachers that are being successful, at some point I'm going to say, I don't understand why you're not being successful, but I'm not going to put more kids with you. And so I agree that the first, second, third, fifth failure, you learn something. But at some point, my job is to get some winners to move. And you've got to show me you learned something, right?
If you can tell me why you failed.
Yeah.
I will be very pleased, but if you can't tell me why you failed, then that's something different. And that's coming from a recovering politician.
I have to be a mean guy.
I mean, I would say that the question earlier, what is a high-performing organization?
Right.
It's one that tries things and learns from it and gets continuous improvement is, okay. And I would say, too, in terms of high-performing, we talked at the break, is another aspect of a high-performing NGO, which we definitely need, is their ability to operate in a collaborative way with other NGOs. And if that was like, oh, okay, you're great at what you do, how do you work with other people in this space? Oh, we don't do that. You know, it's like, okay, so that might be something where you could develop that muscle so that you're not only good at what you do, but you're good at working in a collaborative context. And that could say, okay, so we want high-performing NGOs, we just have more criteria of what high-performing is.
Gotcha. Well, gentlemen and ladies, we've had spirited and I think enormously impressive and important conversation. Let's thank our panel.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. I'm Mark Kramer, one of the founders of FSG and a managing director. And boy, what a conference, huh? Wasn't this a good day? I want to just take 5 or 10 minutes to offer some closing thoughts. But before I do, I also want to thank the many people that it took to make this conference happen so successfully. So I certainly want to thank Stanford Social Innovation Review, Eric Nee, Regina Ridley, Tamara Strauss. I want to thank Stanford University and the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, Laura Arriaga Andreessen, Johanna Meyer, Kim Meredith. I want to thank our speakers and panelists for doing such a great job. I want to thank our financial sponsors, the Mattel Children's Foundation, the Entrepreneurs Foundation, Marguerite Casey Foundation, Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And I certainly want to thank the FSG team, and particularly Donna Janczek and Michelle Morgan Nelson for tremendous work to pull all this together. So let's thank them. I also want to thank all of you, because I have to say I have been extraordinarily impressed by the level of energy at this conference, the intensity of the table conversations, just the energy in the room all day. And we really want this to be the beginning of a way to learn from each other, to continue to move forward the ideas of collective impact, to make them stronger, to make them better, to get an even deeper understanding of what works. And so one of the things we're going to do is send you an evaluation form after this conference, but with the evaluation form, we're going to ask if you'd like to stay in touch with other people who've been at the conference, if you want to stay in touch around particular regions or particular issues, and if we can begin to, if I can say it, take a collective impact approach to promoting collective impact. By beginning to share learning and work together, I think this can really be the start of something. So I hope you'll offer to participate. I also want to shamelessly promote a book that John and I and our partner Leslie Crutchfield just wrote. I think we're going to actually have copies for sale outside, and I think we're actually going to be signing copies, I'm told. It actually isn't officially published until Monday, so you have an advance copy. But it's called Do More Than Give, and it captures much of our thinking, including the collective impact thinking. And thinking about the book reminded me of one of the stories in the book that we talk about. And we talk about a terrific program that the Gates Foundation launched around homelessness in the Pacific Northwest. It was called Sound Families. And they did a terrific job of picking really effective grantees. And they spent millions of dollars, and they created housing for many single homeless mothers. And they evaluated it carefully. And each of the grantees did exactly what they promised to do. It was a rare success. And at the same time, over the 5 years of the program, homelessness increased in the region. And I think we so often confuse funding good nonprofits or building good nonprofits with solving social problems. And it's not the same thing. And I think part of the power and importance of collective impact is to say it is about solving social problems. It's not just about funding good nonprofits. It's not just about doing philanthropy in a strategic and knowledgeable way. And that's really a different endeavor. As we heard, and I think as was said well today, having high-performing nonprofits is necessary, but it's really not sufficient. You know, one of the themes in our article that I think didn't come out as strongly today as I might have hoped is the fact that the alliances we're talking about, the collective impact initiatives, are cross-sector. The ones we've studied, the ones we know involve government, they involve business, they involve funders, and they involve nonprofits. Each of these has a piece of the puzzle, and you can't solve a social problem without beginning to get that alignment among all of them. I think we came up with 5 components of collective impact. We think there's something to them. We think it's different than just collaboration. It really involves some very specific activities. But I'm not sure that those 5 components are the perfect components of it. I think as we engage in collective impact, as you pursue your collective impact initiatives, we'll learn more about the nuances, as Kyle said, the nuances that are necessary to make collective impact work. But I think the core element is that it's about making a system function better. It's not about an individual player. It is about how all of the players fit together. And as Sterling said, it's not about finding what works, or as John said at the beginning, it's not about the silver bullet. But it's about helping the many different things that all work to some degree begin to work to a better degree. John took us back to prehistoric times this morning. I'm not going to go that far back. But I do want to go a few decades back to a book that influenced my thinking a lot, which was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, and I'm sure many of you read it. And it was a very influential book because we'd always sort of assumed that science is an open-ended inquiry toward truth. And what Kuhn pointed out is that at any given time, there is a paradigm, a prevailing paradigm of how the world works. And that determines which experiments scientists decide to pursue. And so it isn't really open-ended, it's determined by the paradigm. But what's really interesting is at the same time there's this prevailing paradigm, there are anomalies. There's lots of evidence that the paradigm is actually wrong. And yet it persists for decades, despite the evidence that it's wrong. And the key is it persists until a new paradigm appears. We're coming up to the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Carnegie Corporation, which was really the first modern American foundation. And I think for most of these 100 years, we've had a paradigm that we've operated under that says it is about the silver bullet. It is about finding what works. It is about finding a great model program, evaluating it with a randomized control trial to be sure it was this program that had the impact, and then scaling it up or getting it replicated. And I think there is plenty of evidence that by and large that paradigm doesn't work. But I think we've been stuck with it until we could come up with a new one. And my hope is that today, this conference is the beginning of a new paradigm that focuses on the systems, that focuses on the principles of collective impact as a way of achieving large-scale change. It doesn't mean that scaling good organizations is wrong. It doesn't mean we don't need high-performing nonprofits. We do. But it means we need to pick a different paradigm if we're going to have different results in the coming generations. And I really believe that we are in a position that we can create much greater impact on the social problems that have plagued us for decades in the coming years, and that collective impact is part of that answer. So thank you very much for being here today and being part of this. And we'd like to invite you to a reception outside. Please join us for drinks and conversation. And again, thank you for being here.